sign the papers, I told myself. Just sign them and get it over with. I didn't. That choice, that one quiet, invisible choice, is the reason I'm sitting here today with everything I built still intact. And the reason my brother is sitting somewhere with a stack of documents that are completely, legally, beautifully worthless. But I'm getting ahead of myself. My name is Laurel. I'm 31 years old. I work in commercial real estate, which means I spend my days reading contracts the way other people read thriller novels, looking for the twist, the trap, the clause buried in paragraph 14 that nobody bothered to highlight. I'm good at it. I've been good at it since I was 19, and my mother handed me a lease agreement for a storage unit and said, just tell me where to sign. And I found a $200 auto-renewal clause she would have paid for the next 6 years without blinking. That's who I am. That's who I've always been. My brother Declan is 2 years older than me and has never read a contract in his life. He signs things the way people swipe through terms and conditions, fast, distracted, already thinking about what comes next. He's charming, which is the polite word for it. The less polite word is manipulative, but in our family, we didn't use that word. We used charming. We used free-spirited. We used charming. We used free-spirited. We used Declan is just figuring things out, give him time. I gave him 29 years. That felt like enough. Our father passed away 18 months ago. Pancreatic cancer, fast and brutal. He was gone in 4 months from diagnosis, which meant there wasn't much time for long conversations about legacy and fairness and what he actually wanted. There was just paperwork and pain, and a family that didn't handle either one well. Dad owned a rental property, a 4-unit building in a mid-sized city about 2 hours from where I grew up. He bought it in his 40s, paid it off slowly, and it had been generating steady income for the last decade. When he got sick, he was collecting around $4,000 a month from it after expenses. Not life-changing money, but stable, consistent, real. He told me about it one afternoon near the end, when it was just the two of us and he was having one of his clearer days. He said he wanted me to manage it after he was gone. He said he knew I understood these things. He said Declan could have the house, the family home where he and my mother still lived, because Declan was already talking about moving back and the house needed someone there. I said okay. I thought that was the plan. What I didn't know, what nobody told me, was that my father's will had not been updated since Declan and I were teenagers. In that version, everything was split evenly between us. The rental property included. I found this out 3 weeks after the funeral, sitting in an attorney's office that smelled like old coffee and carpet cleaner. The attorney, a quiet man named Mr. O.C., walked us through the documents with the patient energy of someone who had delivered this kind of news many times before. He paused after each section to see if we had questions. Declan had no questions. He was already doing something on his phone. I had a lot of questions. Equal ownership of the rental property meant we both had to agree on decisions. Repairs, rent adjustments, tenant issues, potential sale. It also meant if one of us wanted to sell and the other didn't, we'd end up in a legal standoff that could get expensive and ugly very fast. I should have seen it coming. But grief does something strange to the part of your brain that handles strategy. For a few weeks after my father died, I was just a daughter who had lost her dad. I wasn't an analyst. I wasn't reading the fine print. I was eating cereal for dinner and watching television. I don't remember and forgetting to call people back. By the time I came back to myself, the situation had already started to shift. Declan called me about 6 weeks after the funeral. Normal start to the conversation. Asked how I was doing, mentioned he was thinking about picking up some consulting work, said he'd been over to the house a few times to check on our mother. Then, about 8 minutes in, almost like an afterthought, he said he'd been talking to a real estate investor, a guy he knew through a friend. Apparently this person was interested in the rental property. I asked what kind of interested. Cash offer, Declan said. Quick close. He rattled off a number. I was quiet for a moment. The number was low. Not insultingly low, it was in the plausible range. but it was about $60,000 under what I estimated the property was worth based on comparable sales in that area over the past 18 months. I told him I wasn't ready to sell. He said he understood. He said no pressure. The pressure started 2 weeks later. It came from my mother first, which I should have expected. She called on a Tuesday evening, and within 4 sentences, we were talking about the property. She said Declan had mentioned the offer. She said it seemed like a fair price. She said your father would have wanted things kept simple, honey. He didn't want you kids fighting over money. I told her I wasn't fighting over anything. I just didn't want to sell a cash flowing asset at below market value to someone Declan met through a friend. She said I was being difficult. That word, difficult. I had been hearing it my entire life in this family, applied specifically to moments when I asked questions that nobody else wanted to answer. When I was 12 and asked why Declan got a bigger allowance even though he never finished his chores. When I was 22 and asked why I was expected to contribute to a family vacation that I hadn't been consulted about. Every time I wanted a reason for something instead of just accepting it, I was being difficult. I stopped arguing about the word a long time ago. I just noted it, the way you note weather before a long drive. Over the next 3 months, the calls continued. Variations on the same theme. The investor's offer was still on the table. The property needed a new HVAC system soon, and neither of us had money to spare for capital improvements. The tenants were getting older and might leave. The market wasn't going to stay strong forever. Each call added a new piece to a picture that was supposed to convince me that selling now, at this price, was the smart and reasonable thing to do. What none of them knew was that I had been managing that property unofficially for the last 2 years of my father's life. I had found the current tenants. I had negotiated the lease terms. I had coordinated the roof repair in October of the year before he got sick. I knew that building the way I knew my own apartment, I knew what it was worth, and I knew that the investor Declan had found was almost certainly someone who would flip it or raise rents dramatically and displace people who had been there for years. I told Declan I needed more time to think. He said okay. He said he understood. Here is something I've learned about people who say they understand. Sometimes they do, and sometimes they're just waiting for a better angle. I came home from work on a Wednesday in March to find a FedEx envelope on my kitchen counter. My mother had a key to my apartment, a leftover from when I'd had a minor surgery 2 years prior, and she'd offered to water my plants and I'd never asked for it back. That is a separate lesson. Inside the envelope was a purchase and sale agreement for the rental property. Both signature lines had dates already filled in. My line was blank. Declan's was signed. Clipped to the front was a note in my mother's handwriting. It said the investor needed an answer by Friday. It said this was the right thing for the family. It said I love you and please just sign this, Laurel. I stood in my kitchen for a long time. I want to be honest about what I felt because I think it matters. There was anger, obviously. There was the hot, specific humiliation of someone using a spare key you trusted them with to leave paperwork on your counter. There was something older and quieter underneath that. Something I don't have a clean word for. The feeling of being the person in your family who is expected to be reasonable while everyone else gets to want things loudly without justification. But underneath all of that, there was something else. Something I recognized from work. From years of reading documents under pressure and finding the thing that didn't fit. There was clarity. I didn't call Declan that night. I didn't call my mother. I called my friend Portia, who was a paralegal and was eating leftover Thai food when she picked up. I read her the agreement over the phone. She asked me 3 questions. Then she said, sit on this for 24 hours and then call an actual attorney. I called an attorney the next morning. A real estate attorney in my city named Ms. Mekuya Farquhar, who had been recommended to me by a colleague and who, within 40 minutes of looking at the documents I'd emailed her, called me back with information I had not fully considered. Because we were co-owners of the property, a sale required both our signatures. I knew that part. What I hadn't thought through carefully was the mechanism that was being proposed. The purchase and sale agreement had been structured, with Declan listed as the primary seller and me listed as a secondary signatory. The way it was written, my signature would be interpreted as consent to the sale terms, including the price, including the timeline, including a clause on page 4 that allocated all closing costs to the seller, which, split equally, would reduce my net proceeds by several $1,000s more than I'd assumed. It was not illegal. It was just very, very favorable to the buyer. And Declan had signed it, which meant if I signed it too, we were locked in. Miss Farquhar asked me if I wanted to sell. I told her I wanted to think about my options. She laid them out. I could sign and accept the terms. I could refuse to sign and force a negotiation or a partition lawsuit, which would be slow, expensive, and emotionally brutal. Or, and she said this carefully, I could make a counterproposal. I had the right to do that. I had the right to bring my own terms to any transaction involving a property I co-owned. The fact that Declan had already signed one version did not obligate me to anything. I asked her what a counterproposal might look like. She said that was really up to me. I took a walk that afternoon. I do that when I'm working through a problem that feels too large for a desk. I put on shoes and go outside and let the physical act of moving help me think. I walked for about an hour. I went past a coffee shop I like, past a park where two dogs were having a very serious disagreement about a stick, past a dry cleaner's with a sign in the window that said alterations done right the first time, which felt meaningful in a way I chose not to examine too closely. By the time I got back to my building, I knew what I was going to do. I was not going to sign. I was also not going to refuse outright, because refusal was a wall and I didn't want a wall. I wanted a door. A door I controlled. I went back to Ms. Farquhar. I told her what I wanted. She drafted a counterproposal over the following week. It had several elements, but the core of it was this. I would agree to sell my half interest in the property, but only under specific conditions. The property would be independently appraised by a certified appraiser of my choosing. The sale price would be no less than 95% of the appraised value. Any allocation of closing costs would be split proportionally and clearly itemized. And this was the part that mattered most. The proposed buyer would be required to provide proof of funds and agree to maintain current tenant occupancy for a minimum of 12 months post-closing. Declan was going to hate the last clause. His investor friend almost certainly planned to renovate and release at higher rates. That 12-month occupancy requirement would either kill the deal or significantly reduce the investor's interest, which would bring the offer price down, which would actually end up benefiting us both if we did sell. I sent the counter-proposal through Miss Farquhar's office, formally and in writing, on a Friday afternoon. Sunday evening, Declan called. I let it ring twice before I picked up, which I know is petty and I am fine with that. He started calmly. He said he'd received my counter-proposal. He said he appreciated that I was taking this seriously. He said, and I knew this phrasing was deliberate, that he thought I was overcomplicating things. I said I thought I was protecting an asset we co-owned. His voice shifted. He said the investor wasn't going to agree to those terms. He said the 12-month occupancy clause was unreasonable for a buyer making a cash offer at a competitive price. I did not point out that the price was not, in fact, competitive. I had learned a long time ago that with Declan, the less information you give, the better positioned you are. He said he needed to know if I was actually going to be a partner in this or if I was just going to obstruct everything. I said I was a co-owner of a property and I was exercising my legal rights as a co-owner. He said Mom was really upset. I said I was sorry to hear that. He hung up. I will not pretend the next few weeks were pleasant. My mother called 4 times. 3 of those calls followed the same pattern. Concern layered over pressure, layered over something that felt like grief being redirected into frustration, which I understood even while it exhausted me. The 4th call was different. She was quiet in a way she isn't usually, and she said she had talked to Declan, and she said she was starting to wonder if she'd been given the full picture. I did not say anything dramatic. I just said there was a lot of information and I was happy to share all of it with her whenever she was ready. She called again 2 days later. I walked her through everything: the comps I'd pulled, the appraisal process, the closing cost clause, the occupancy restriction, and what it implied about the investor's intentions. I did not editorialize. I did not say Declan misled you, even though that is what I believed. I just read her the facts the way Mr. Osei had read us the will, patient, clear, one section at a time. She was quiet for a long time after I finished. Then she said, "Why didn't you just tell me all this from the beginning?" I thought about that for a moment, and I said, honestly, because I didn't think you'd hear it until you were ready. She didn't argue with that. The appraisal came back 6 weeks later. The property's fair market value was assessed at significantly above the original offer. The gap was just under $75,000. My mother saw the number. Declan saw the number. The investors saw the number. The investor withdrew. Declan called me, and this time I heard something in his voice I hadn't heard before. Not anger, we'd been through that. Something more like the particular deflation of a person who had been very confident in a plan and is now holding the pieces of it. He said the deal had fallen through. He said he was going to need some time to figure out next steps. I said okay. I said we could talk about it whenever he was ready. We have not talked about it yet. That was 4 months ago. Here's what actually happened after the investor walked away. 2 months later, I brought my mother a different proposal. A local property management company had flagged our building as a potential acquisition at appraised value. They were specifically looking for stabilized rental properties with long-term tenants, exactly what ours was. The offer came in at full appraisal, clean terms. The 12-month occupancy clause was not an obstacle for this buyer. It actually aligned with their strategy. The closing costs were split clearly and fairly. Declan signed within 3 days of receiving the documents. My net proceeds were over $40,000 more than they would have been under the original deal. Declan's were the same. The tenants have a buyer committed to keeping them housed. My father's building sold to people who are going to take care of it. I wired my portion to a separate investment account the day after closing. I had opened that account 3 months earlier in my name only. Nobody in my family knows which institution it's at. I did not feel guilty about that. I felt something cleaner, the quiet satisfaction of a person who has finally finished building a wall that should have gone up years ago. The last conversation I had with Declan about any of this was a week after closing. He texted me, not called. He said he was glad the sale went through. He said he hoped we could move forward. He said he thought there had been some miscommunication along the way. I read that text 3 times. I thought about everything that word covered: the envelope on my kitchen counter, the calls from our mother on a script I recognized but couldn't prove, the original agreement with its quietly tilted terms, the investor who would have displaced 4 families who had built routines and lives in that building, miscommunication. I typed back, "I'm glad it worked out. Take care of yourself, Declan." I put my phone down and poured a cup of coffee and sat by my window for a while. Outside, the neighborhood was doing what it always does. People walking dogs, someone arguing with a parking meter, a kid on a bicycle going way too fast down the sidewalk, ordinary and ongoing. I watched it for a while and felt, for the first time in about 18 months, something I can only describe as settled. Not happy, exactly, not triumphant, just settled. Like a house after the foundation is repaired. Nothing dramatic, nothing visible from the outside, but underneath, something solid where there used to be a crack. I think about what I would tell myself from 2 years ago. The version who still believed the family narrative, that I was the difficult one, the over-analytical one, the one who made things harder than they needed to be. I would tell her this. Being the person who reads the contract is not the same as being the difficult one. It is not difficult to want to understand what you're agreeing to. It is not difficult to ask for the numbers to make sense. It is not difficult to say, "I need more time," or "I need this in writing," or "I need to talk to someone who knows more than I do about this." What is actually difficult? What takes the real effort, the invisible, sustained effort that nobody sees, is doing all of that while everyone around you is calling it a problem, while your mother is hurt, while your brother is disappointed, while the story being told in your family is that you are the one making this complicated. I was never making it complicated. I was the only one making it legible. And when the dust settled, when the documents were filed and the wires cleared and the keys exchanged, I was also the one who had made sure that everyone, even the people who'd worked against me, came out of it with a fair result, including Declan. Including my mother, who will not lose a second property the way she almost lost the first one now that she understands what questions to ask. I don't think I'll ever be the golden child. I made peace with that somewhere around age 14, and I've never picked that argument back up. But I am the one who kept the inheritance intact. I am the one the tenants can thank for their stable rents. I am the one who knew, quietly and without announcement, exactly what everything was worth. That is enough for me. That is enough for me. That has always been enough for me. I've thought a lot about why I didn't just sign that first contract and walk away. The money would have been less, but the peace might have been faster. Or so I told myself at 2 in the morning a few times during those months, lying awake running the numbers again, wondering if I was making everything harder than it needed to be. But here's what I kept coming back to. There's a version of keeping the peace that is actually just letting someone take from you without making a sound. And I had been doing that version for years. Not because I was weak, but because I had been taught, slowly and consistently, that my objections were the problem, that my questions were friction, that the easiest version of me was the most acceptable one. What changed wasn't my circumstances. It was that I stopped believing that. Declan didn't lose because I outsmarted him. He lost because his plan depended on me not paying attention, and I paid attention. That's the whole story, stripped down to its frame. Every consequence that followed, the investor walking away, the appraisal gap, the replacement deal that served everyone better, all of it flowed from one single decision. I read the documents. I asked the questions. I gave myself the same 24 hours I would have given any client before advising them to sign anything. That's not a special talent. That's just not being in a hurry when someone else needs you to be. I think about the tenants in that building sometimes. 4 households who had no idea any of this was happening. They were just living their lives, paying rent on time, building routines around a place they'd come to trust. They didn't know that for about 4 months, the future of their homes was sitting inside a legal dispute between 2 siblings who couldn't agree on what their father's last asset was worth. They didn't know that one decision, my decision, made alone in my apartment with a FedEx envelope on my counter, was the difference between a landlord who would keep them housed and an investor who would not. I'm not saying this to make myself sound important. I'm saying it because I think we underestimate how far our choices travel, the ones that feel small and private. The decision to read something carefully, to call someone who knows more than you do, to say I need more time when the pressure is telling you to hurry, those choices have edges that extend past yourself into places you'll never fully see. Declan called it miscommunication. I don't think he was being dishonest, exactly. I think he genuinely experienced it that way, because the story he was telling himself was one where I was the obstacle, not the person with the clearest view of the road. That's the thing about being the difficult one in a family. You often have the most accurate information, and nobody wants to hear that. What I know now, more than anything else, is that intelligence without courage is just anxiety. You can understand exactly what's happening to you and still sign the wrong thing. Still stay quiet, still let someone walk out of your kitchen with what's yours. The understanding only becomes useful when you're willing to act on it, even when it costs you something, even when the people you love are disappointed, even when the easier version of you would have made everything calmer on the surface. I chose the harder surface. I would choose it again.